we're continuing today, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 16 and 17. And it's for me, it's a bit strange because I always giggle when people say I don't usually give a title to a talk and then immediately tell them a title, and they do it every time. But a few weeks ago, I just heard something in my spirit, and it's giving God a hand. And as I was reading Genesis, we'd read in chapter 15 how God spoke this powerful word over Abram. And he said, I'm going to give you a son. There is the promise. And Abram's believed God, and God's done this amazing, amazing place where he's made a covenant, or begun to make a covenant with Abram. And I don't know whether we will see or not, but when you look at chapter 15 and chapter 17 and chapter 22 of Genesis, you see the three parts of the covenant. That first there's a promise, and then after that there's a sign, and after that there's an oath. And that's one of the things that God does when he's making covenants. He makes a promise, he makes a sign of it, and he makes an oath of it. And you'll see that massively when you're reading in Hebrews, when it speaks about God did it with a promise, he did it with a sign, and he did it with an oath. And when we come to chapter 16, we actually have a chapter in Genesis where God doesn't say anything at all to Abram. That's fascinating. He talks to Hagar, but he doesn't talk to Abram. And so just returning to chapter 15, where God has said, you are going to have a son. Can you imagine Abram racing back to Sarah and said, God said, I'm going to have a son. God said he's going to make descendants as much as the sand of the seashore and the stars in the sky out of my children. And if you just cast your mind and sort of think what Sarah's response was, you know, we've been married for 50 years now, and I haven't managed to have a child. When you look back in Genesis 11, it actually says Sarah was barren. And everyone's going on about, oh, I'm going to have a child, I'm going to have a son. And she's saying, who are you kidding? You know, the problem is that the word's gone to Abram, and he said, it's all about me. And she hasn't picked up that and he hasn't really even picked up that it's about the pair of them, that God has called them together. And so in her frustration, she turns to Abram and said, well, it can't be me, I can't help you. Why don't you take my servant girl and have a baby through her? And Abram, can you imagine it? He's just had God saying, you're going to have a child. And he doesn't bat an eyelid when his wife says, oh, take Hagar. And you can just hear him saying, hey, I'm going to do that. There wasn't a protest. There wasn't anything. He just said, oh, yeah, I wish I'd have thought of that. He said, I'm going to help God out. God's made me a promise, and I'm going to do and help him out. You know, I just was so aware that sometimes when prophetic words come, God has a timing in them. In this case, I don't know how significant it is, but it just seems as though, because it's going to be 13 years between the time God says you're going to have a son and when he comes and speaks to Abram and says, this time next year. We're going to see 13, 14 years before Isaac is born to Sarah. But in the meantime, Abram's gone with Hagar. And what we see straight away is that Hagar gets pregnant and then shows contempt for Sarah. And in this passage, we see something really significant that you'll see time and time again. So when a prophetic word comes and an attempt is made to speed it up, to make it go faster, to make it happen, to help God out, the product of that will despise the true process that God was wanting. And in this case, Abram had a baby with Hagar, and it was an Ishmael. And when we try to take what God is doing, taking his promise, and put our own legs on it, we end up with an Ishmael. And for the Jewish people, even now, what is nearly 3,000 years later, over 3,000 years later, we have the situation that Ishmael is still kicking out at the people of God. Whenever we try to give birth to something that God is promising in our own strength, it will always produce an Ishmael. The neat thing is that God doesn't step in and say, hey, Hagar, you're actually a misplace here. He says, you have found yourself coming into my promise. You shouldn't have been there. The door's been illegally opened, but still I will bless the product of what this is. And so sometimes we find that something looks like it's being blessed because it's touched God's presence, but it isn't what he was doing in the first place. And as I was just praying that through, I just became so aware of times that I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, where prophetic words have come. And those prophetic words have caused people to jump into action when the Lord's timing wasn't there. I was struck earlier as I was reading in 1 Kings, and I think it's chapter 17 perhaps, where the prophet comes to Jeroboam and says, you know, the God's going to destroy this altar, and a guy called Josiah is going to do it. It's 300 years before that prophecy comes about in 2 Kings chapter 23. God's timing is not our timing, but his process has us exactly in the right place if we follow what he's doing. I was thinking of a friend who he heard the name of someone and felt the Lord was saying, you're going to marry that person. So when he met that person, he chased after it and married them and very quickly divorced from it. I mean, he himself says the foolishness of it. I've seen people have promises, the Lord's spoken to them, that he is going to give them wealth, and they chased after the wealth. I remember once an amazing word where the Lord said to them, I'm going to give you wealth whether you're in my kingdom or not. And the chasing after the wealth put them out of the kingdom. They had no interest in the things of the Lord anymore. You know, if the Lord is promising something, he is the one that will bring it about. There are times that we need to do what he says. Philip on the road was said, go on that road and just do this. He followed God. He did exactly what he was told, but he didn't have any understanding of what he was about. Then the Lord said, go up to the man in the chariot. God gives in specific instructions by the Holy Spirit. And when he gives those specific instructions, we should follow them. But sometimes he says something to us that is a promise for the future. For Abram, he said, I'm giving you a son. It meant that the stuff that was going to come against him in the next 13 years, he had a word to hold on to. He had something, a promise of God. When you have a promise of God, you can hold on to it no matter what. He will bring it about at his time. For Abram, he was going to take that promise. He was going to bring a sign. And 13 years later, in the next chapter, in chapter 17, we have the sign. It's a sign of circumcision. But at the end of that, it says, Abram and Ishmael were circumcised on the same day. The Lord had first of all given a promise. Then he'd made a sign. And then he's going to make an oath in chapter 22. But Abraham had raced after doing it his own way. I just want to share a couple of thoughts from my life. What must be now 30 years ago, I had a prophetic word, and Sharon and I had this word together. But part of this word that was, though you're a peon in the organization, you will speak to the people in the highest positions. And I had this word, and at that stage, I was a manager in a Fortune 100 company, and I reported directly to the general manager, and he directly reported into the board. So I wasn't exactly a peon in the organization. But like Mary did, she says that she took things and treasured them in her heart. I put that word on the shelf saying, Lord, I don't understand that word, but I believe if you're doing something. And a couple of years later, we had a corporate restructuring. I found myself out of work, and I began a consulting business. And because of the consulting business, I got to know some people at a local college. And eventually, I found myself, the Lord showing me to take a job at the local college. It was any job, and it was actually a low pay, it was a low-level administrative role. And I was talking to my friend, and he said, even though this is a peon's job, you'll soon be able to rise up within the organization. Now, I don't know how often you hear the word peon spoken in a conversation and how often you hear it spoken in a prophetic word. But all of a sudden, I knew that I was in the right place. And I got the opportunity to share the love of God with the highest people in that college. But it wasn't me chasing after the word, but it was the word chasing after me. How often we've had prophetic words that we've not known how to progress with them, but when they've come about, we've been able to say, the Lord has held us through, and this is where we should be. I remember when we first had the prophetic word to return from the States and come back to the UK to pastor. We could have just jumped and said, we'll go and do this, this, and this. But when we submitted it to our pastors, they said, we believe that is the word from the Lord, but hold it, let him show you the timing. And over the next 3 years, 4 times we had a prophetic word saying, a man is praying for someone to come and take over his church. When the time came and the Lord made it clear that it was time to return, the timing of that was perfect to the day when we met Brother Keith Williamson, who said, I have been praying for the last 3 years for someone to come and take over my church. Later on, we discovered that the very weekend that we met with them for the first time, it's a long story, but the denominational church in which they were under had told them that they would be closing them. God answered Keith's prayer, but the timing of his answer was perfected, and he had us moving in his word, resting in his word to exactly the right place. When there was a time to move, the Lord said, move, and we moved. But it would have been so easy to chase after the word, trying to give God a hand. Abram tried to give God a hand. He tried to help out. When we try to help out, we'll make Ishmaels. When we try to do it. But the Lord uses his word. Sometimes, as I say, there's very specific words and said, do this now, and we must do it now. But sometimes those words are speaking of something very clear. They are saying, there is something I'm doing, trust me. And what you find yourself doing is when decisions have to be made, is this in line with the word the Lord's given me, or is it something else? He makes it plain what we should be doing. He uses his word to direct us. He uses his word to confirm, actually, I'm in the right place because this is what he said. God is doing something, and he's doing a fresh thing. And it's good for us to review what he said, not saying, oh, that doesn't seem to fit, but being ready to say, Lord, I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you. Walking in faith, mixing his word with faith, not racing after it, not saying, how can I help him? Abram said, I'm going to help God out. I'm going to help him. He needs a helping hand. And I just sensed as I was reading this, the Lord speaking afresh to us. Trust him, believe his word, walk in faith, but don't find yourself trying so hard to help him out. When we look and see, there's words he's spoken over some of us, that dreams that we've had. And when you turn around, you find yourself living the dream, but you didn't even realize it was happening. And then you see, actually, the Lord has been with me. The Lord has cared for me in this. Let's never be hasty to try to help God out, but let's be honest in truth, walking in faith, believing what he's saying. Amen. That's just perhaps a bit shorter than some other ones, but I just felt the Lord was saying, Abram tried and said, Lord, let me help you out. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to walk in faith, to be obedient, to do what he tells us, and to stand firm, knowing that his timing is the timing that we should be working on, not our own. Impatience is not one of the gifts of the Spirit or the fruit of the Spirit. He loves us and he's working his purposes out in our lives. Let's chase after him with everything, not chasing after his promises and his blessings. Let's chase after his kingdom, working our lives for his kingdom.